Welcome to the Experience Strategy Podcast, where we talk to customers and experts about how to create products and services that feel like time well spent. And now, here are your hosts, experienced strategists, Dave Norton and Aranza Savas.
Welcome to the Experience Strategy Podcast. I'm Aranza Savas.
And I'm Dave Norton.
And today we are joined by Gary David. Gary is a professor of sociology and a professor of information design and corporate communication at Bentley University. Gary has really unique lens on experience design. He's the founder of Ethnoanalytics, which is a consultancy that focuses on integrating design and aligning experiences. He has, I think, a really exciting perspective on how we integrate stakeholders across all aspects of an organization, from the employee experience to the end user experience, as well as the organizational design itself that feeds into our experience strategies. Gary's worked with lots of companies, big and small, to help them align. And so he also brings a rich insight into how we take these big ideas and translate them into impactful action. You have probably heard from him if you're a big podcast listener in this space on his show, Experience by Design. You can also hear from him on Twitch, where he's an educational live streamer under the moniker ProfessorEXP. So today we're going to look at the role ethnography plays in experience design, how we use the lessons of cultural ethnography to help us translate complex environments into something understandable and something that can create a sense of true integration for customers in a journey. We'll look at how this applies to customer experience, to user experience, to patient experience, to employee experience, and all the experiences, and how we can learn to speak one another's languages more fluently for the good of customers and companies. Let's welcome Professor EXP.
Great to be here. I'm glad to make it from chilly Lake Placid, New York, where I'm currently on relocation. Not technically a vacation because I'm still doing work, but I'm not at home.
I kind of feel like the only sucker here because I'm sitting here at home in my apartment with a sick kid in the other room. Meanwhile, you're cross-country skiing in Lake Placid and Dave is at the other end of Chile and Chile.
Exactly.
One of us is not making good life choices here.
Yeah, right. Rances.
You also, I noticed, have the
kids, right?
darkest suntan of any of us, probably not by accident.
Yep.
So, Gary, as we jump right in here, what's the focus of your work these days?
That's a great question, and I wish I had an easy answer because one of the things that
answers.
Yeah, it's very complicated. My therapy is not till Thursday, so I'll try to save that story till then. Part of what drew me to sociology, I am a sociologist, is the ability to explore a lot of different worlds in a lot of different areas. And that's both a blessing and a curse. But it also, I think, makes me a good experience designer because having varied interest and having an understanding of complex environments and all the different elements that are part of those environments allows me to, I hope, more easily navigate those settings. So part of what I'm trying to do is develop course material to introduce students to experience design, along with doing my own work as a consultant and a speaker on what I call experience integration, and how does experience design as a profession work and what does it look like?
I love that you jump right into complexity of environments. And I think that we are by definition in a complex environment that feels even more complex because it's unfamiliar. And we're collectively learning our way around this environment, like new tourists. Except we're in a world that maybe there are no locals, and so I'd love to hear what you're seeing in terms of complexity in the CX world these days.
Yeah, it's as an ethnographer is a person who studies new worlds, right? Worlds that are unfamiliar to us as researchers, but are familiar to the people who live in them. Part of our goal is to unpack that unfamiliarity and translate it to broader audiences. So being an ethnographer makes me pretty comfortable in unfamiliar situations where you're trying to navigate this new landscape and trying to understand how things work. And in many ways, this is the broader field of experience design. And so as we think about customer experience versus user experience versus employee experience versus patient experience versus et cetera experience, part of that challenge that I'm trying to tap into and talk about is how do we bring those things together and create alignment so that they work together more seamlessly and not at odds with one another.
Yeah, I spent some time in service design, and so much of my responsibility was to integrate and unify the customer experience by understanding the employee experience and the tech experience, and it was harrowing. It was honestly the hardest job I've ever had, other than parenting, and it was probably difficult in the same way in that everyone was speaking different languages and everyone was competing for ownership and impact and influence using the language that they spoke.
Right. And one of the classes I teach at the grad level at my school, which is Bentley University, is called Ethnography for Experience Design. And one of the things about being an ethnographer is that we exist in what I would call liminal spaces. We often exist in between groups because when we're in these new environments, we don't belong to any subgroup or subculture, but we have to communicate with all of them. And those research skills are directly translatable into consulting or professional skills in experience design because we find ourselves often having to move between groups and translate and hopefully mediate and get them to play nice together, especially when we're designing systems, services, processes, environments that need to serve all stakeholders.
You know, Gary, one of the things that I find kind of troubling, but also I think is a reality is that the people who do service design, the people who do CX, the people who do employee engagement, patient experience, and so forth, they're trained in similar techniques. But to Arances's point, they all speak different languages. They're focused on different aspects of the experience. They have different tools, oftentimes, and techniques that they use. Ethnography is traditionally used by pretty much everyone, but can you talk to why it is that we have these different languages that are coming out of a common focus around the customer and the experience that the customer has?
I think as a person who studies professions and occupations, and I've been doing that through my entire career, we look at how different professions are socialized, okay? And by socialized, I mean not just what people learn in school as part of training, and CX does not have much of that in terms of educational programming that are part of educational institutions, but we develop a way of talking and a way of doing and a way of being that is given to us when we do this kind of coursework. And then that further gets enhanced or enforced, or we get a new sense of what that means when we actually do the practice of the job, when we start to do the work and become part of this professional community. And so when you have different fields, it's not surprising that you're going to have different languages. This is how cultures evolve and get created, right? They get created in spaces in which people are affiliating with one another around particular tasks. They develop symbols, they develop communication methods, rituals, totems, symbolism. We develop all these things, which then becomes peculiar to us and potentially indecipherable to others. And this is why, as experience designers, we kind of have to be multilingual, right? We have to be able to speak experience, or employee experience, customer experience, user experience, patient experience, learning experience. And being able to speak all of those things, we can then translate between those communities and do what I would call, community building or community organizing, and to create this larger experience strategy.
I love that. So I'm curious what we've learned from history, both from other innovations, but also cultural history, about how we integrate without diluting the impetus behind some of these languages, right? Like, so each of these disciplines was created for a reason.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes that cross reasons, especially when you're looking at, I teach in a UX program, or what's primarily user experience program. And so you get this shift away from what UX was originally about, which was serving the needs of the users, making things more usable. That's why it was originally called usability, not user experience. And now we're shifting into more dark patterns, where we want to use our understanding of psychology, sociology, culture, not to further the needs of the user, but to further the needs of the company, which puts it directly at odds potentially with customer experience. And so this is where you can get these friction points, right? So you have one part, which is trying to get you click on one button and not the other, which is trying to get you to subscribe and not unsubscribe. And is that servicing the customer voice, the voice of the customer? Not necessarily. I mean, is marketing servicing the voice of the customer? Not necessarily. And so where does customer experience sit in this larger organizational framework? How is it integrated or kept separate from user experience? And how does it relate to the larger employee experience? And my sense of things is most companies are not having this conversation. They're just leaving it to, it's almost like, parents. It's like, go to your rooms, quit arguing. Right. And like going down to Chile or something like that and not being at home.
Yeah. The question becomes, who gets the final say, right? At the end of the day, you have these different disciplines. They each have a focus. Some of those focuses can either change over time, like we've seen with user experience, and I agree with you there on usability being the original thing. But who gets the final say on what really matters at the end of the day? And Gary, do you have a point of view on that? Who should get the final say?
Well, Dave, I have a PhD. I always have a point of view, and I'm happy to answer that question. Before we jumped on today, I was just writing. I was asked to write an editorial for the Journal of Health Design on electronic health record systems and the design of those kinds of systems, along with medical records. And one of the sections I was just working on is called customization, standardization, and prioritization. Sound familiar? And from a design justice standpoint, if we want to think about justice and ethics in design, and that might be a nice concept to consider, we might think about the voices of the most marginalized and the voices of the most powerless, and how to elevate those voices as part of the design process, so that they not only are they heard, not only are they included, but also that there's equity in terms of how we consider their needs and the impacts that any design decision has on them. And what that group might be is going to vary depending upon what situation we're talking about designing for. But that needs to be, I would say, part of the conversation if we want to design ethically and from a justice perspective. And the ROI on that, if I can speak cynically here for a second, as I work at a business school, is that it's not just about design, it's not just about implementation, it's about adoption and use. Mm-hmm. And the less you include those voices, the more you're going to run into problems in those latter two phases of adoption and use, which if you're going through the expense of the design and implementation, you probably want to have some adoption and use to have observable impact at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm nodding vigorously because as I was listening to you, it kept dawning on me that literally every stakeholder suffers from disintegration. And we see it for the employees, for the business, but most of all for the customer. And then it becomes cyclical, right? So if the customer isn't thriving because we don't offer an integrated and unified experience, then ultimately the business suffers. But it's really hard, given traditional metrics, for companies to appreciate the cost of that friction. So what are you seeing work?
Yeah. Well, this is where I think we need to talk about mixed methods. And I'm trained in quantitative methods, but I do most of my work in qualitative methods, which I like to use both kinds of methods. And it's not that you measure what matters. Really, it's if you measure it, it matters. And do you want to have measurable impact or actual impact? And what I mean by that is this. You can get things to say whatever you want to say. If you want to measure that you have impact, I'm sure you have smart enough people on your team to find measurements that show you have impact. I work in higher ed. We do this, I won't say all the time, but we can show, did someone learn? Well, what does learning mean? But I can show that someone learned by constructing measures that satisfy the institutional requirement to demonstrate learning. I'm talking like a sociologist here for a second, but are we actually measuring real impact? That's a different question. And we see how infatuated people become with simplified measures, which may not show anything really other than we did something and we'll just call it a day then. We don't want to dig deeper because by digging deeper, we might show that we really haven't done the things we said we were going to do, nor were we serious about doing them in the first place. So how serious are you? Do you really want to understand? What's that?
You're not referring to NPS. I said you're not referring to NPS. You cannot.
No, why would you think that?
By any means. Referring to Net Promoter Score.
We have, there's a saying in sociology, that Marx wouldn't even consider himself to be a Marxist. And by that, I mean, that when you look at how a person's theory gets translated and used, it can often get very far from what the person actually said. And so when we're talking about something like NPS, or we're talking about other things that become totems, right? We talk about totems. They become these sacred objects that I don't want to criticize anybody's sacred object, but at the same time, the magic that object has that magic because we imbue it with that magic, not that it possesses that magic itself. And so, fine, you can have your sacred object, but what if we created other sacred objects that also could be beneficial and useful to understanding what's happening and actually make the magic in real life that we're looking to create?
Well said. Well said.
It's fascinating. Going back, I want to go back for a second to this idea of who gets the final say. And I think part of your answer or your response was to take us down the path of, well, what is getting measured? And you're so right about that. The final say oftentimes has more to do with what is being measured than it has to do with who gets the final say, because the company is going to try to align around that metric and make that metric better. And to your other point, which we've talked about a number of times on this podcast, if you're just focused on likelihood to recommend, there's a lot of things that you're probably going to miss along the way. So it's really, I think this is a really important challenge because we can't oversimplify what the experience is about for the customer. And yet at the same time, the industry as a whole has adopted a very simplistic approach, I think, to trying to express what a good experience is.
And I have sympathy for that. I understand where that's coming from. As an ethnographer, I like to understand the people's worlds and not judge their worlds, but try to understand their worlds. And I get that people, as human beings, our brains can prefer simplicity over complexity because simplicity is easier to understand and it's easier to act upon. And so what we do as creatures is simplify everything, whether it be stereotypes, whether it be schemas, whether it be scores, right? Metrics, we simplify. Part of the experienced designer's job then is to translate complexity into action, is to take that complexity, lean into it, engage in it, and then translate that in a way that makes sense to decision makers and stakeholders, as well as develop approaches to measuring it. And this is where, again, as I'm going to beat this ethnography drum some more. As an ethnographer, and as a sociologist, this is what we're trained in. One of the things that I very much value in my sociological training is that we get trained on a wide variety of research methods, qualitative and quantitative. And I teach a 2-day course on qualitative data analysis to try to show people how we might use that data as a way of furthering our understanding for the purposes of making better design decisions and having better outcomes.
I think you're so right to look at the human tendencies that underpin these decisions. And I think it's on us, frankly, as innovators to find new metrics that are still simplifying, but less simplistic in their understanding of customer journeys.
Yeah, I really love that. I'm going to take it. So thank you for that. So this idea of simplification without, how would we say this? Simplicity without oversimplification? Something like that?
Simplification.
We'll work on it. We'll workshop it.
Yeah.
Yeah, simplification without being simplistic. I really do like that because the allure of oversimplification, right? My background is in intercultural communication. And one of the things that became a very prominent model in intercultural communication was something developed by Gert Hofstede, which you think about masculine, feminine cultures, individual, collective cultures, high context, low context cultures, a lot of these binary definitions. And so people will say things like, American culture is individualistic. And to which I will often say, well, then how come Colin Kaepernick wasn't lauded for his individualism when he knelt for the national anthem? He was derided for not doing everything that everyone else was doing. Mm-hmm. So people talk about, how we all come together as a country. That's not individualism, that's collectivism. So yes, we can be individualistic, but we can also be collective, and what part of the country you're in might have a lot to say in that. So I say all that to say culture is very complex, but nevertheless, people like this model because of how simple it is. We can put things into nice, neat boxes, which makes it feel like we have a better sense of control over things that are not controllable.
Yeah, this actually brings up an interesting topic that I'm really passionate about, and that's framework design. A lot of times what we ask experienced designers to do is to simplify all of the data, the qualitative data, by helping to develop a framework. And what I like about great frameworks is that they tell a good story and they tell it richly enough that you can make a number of different decisions from them. And they're not so simplistic that they kind of reduce everything down to a binary or something like what you're describing. What are your thoughts about frameworks?
I think they can be very useful as heuristics, right? They're these kind of like, conceptualized models that help us have a better understanding of the variables at play and what we need to consider as we examine any situation or any context. So I think frameworks as heuristics can be eminently helpful. It's when we start to see frameworks as reality that we can start to run into trouble, because frameworks don't structure reality, but what we'll end up doing is structuring our understanding of reality to fit that framework, if that makes sense. So rather than thinking about what the framework might sensitize us to in terms of understanding whatever it is we're trying to understand, that framework becomes a determinant in terms of how we force fit the complexity of reality into these nice and tidy, oversimplified boxes. And that's where, when we're making decisions based on those frameworks and not on a deeper understanding of what's real, that's when we can make significant errors in our strategy. And that's where we can make significant errors in our decision making, because we're making decisions based on a framework rather than what's actually out there and that which can be understood.
I'm curious who you use as case studies when you're talking about integration and the lack thereof in companies.
Well, the lack thereof, I mean, I can talk about higher ed because I've been in higher ed for, almost a quarter century. And we're not necessarily good at this. So I'll dish on my own industry a little bit. Higher ed hasn't changed in probably 500 years, right? It's still basically set up as departments that are rooted in discipline areas, professional areas that exist to train other people in that profession so they can too become professionals. And we have classes in our respective domains, and we don't cut across very often. So if you want to see lack of integration, just go to a college campus and look for where all the departments are. I was part of the team that created the first of its kind diversity, equity, and inclusion major. So this is the first one that actually exists in the United States, believe it or not. And when we created it, we intentionally made sure that many different departments were represented in the core of the major, and that students had the opportunity to take electives across departments as well. It would be kind of ironic to have a DEI major that was not diverse, not integrative, not inclusive, and wasn't equitable. So we actually had to fight a little bit to do that because it didn't look like anything anybody had seen before. It has to be owned by one department. And we said it can't be, because this topic is, transdisciplinary. And so we need to be transdisciplinary in our thinking. So we did, and we were successful in creating this major.
And what would it look like if your entire school, let's say, became more integrated across disciplines?
You would have units, administrative units that weren't based on professional training, but were based in areas of subject matter expertise, for instance. So we have something like this at Bentley University. We have a health thought leadership network, which is meant to be integrative across disciplines. But why do I have a sociology department and not a department of healthcare and a department of design? And the department of design that I exist in is very interdisciplinary, by the way. And it is subject matter area based versus disciplinary based. You would have departments based on diversity, equity, and inclusion, based on, technology and integration, whatever it is, right? So you would have these departments that are on subject matter areas, and people could belong to more than one department because they might shift around in terms of the areas of work that they're doing. What usually stops that from happening is that we don't know how to administrate it. We don't know how to govern it. And so what we do is have the tail wag the dog. Even though everyone would say that makes a lot of sense, we can't do it because the system isn't set up to manage it. And so to change that, this requires us changing the system. And that is a whole other proposition. But you do that, honestly, by the small scale victories that you can do to make real the vision in practical outcomes. And that's with this major, that was one of the things we were trying to do, was not just create a major, but to create a different vision of what higher education could look like.
And if you were to translate then these ideas to companies wherein their teams are working at cross purposes, across disciplines, and silos are really destroying the customer experience, what would you advise?
The first thing I always like to do is look at your metrics, because your metrics are often going to incentivize certain behavior, right? And so if your metrics are incentivized for people not to work together, then don't be shocked when people don't work together. And do you have a metric that demonstrates and stipulates interdepartmental work? Do you have an opportunity to reward risk-taking that comes from innovative, creative, cross-disciplinary work? Or are your measurement and reward structures based on traditional enterprise siloed thinking that really makes that kind of work too risky to try? So that would be the first place I would always look. And in higher ed, I have plenty of stories about that, of how our structures are incentivized to keep siloed work. So real quick, for instance, most professors who are trying to get tenure, the only work that counts is if they publish within their discipline. Well, okay, if you're rewarding that, then guess what's going to happen? People are going to write in their language for their discipline. And they're not going to write for broader audiences. Yeah, exactly right. So that's the first thing I start to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting when you first talked about experience measurement. Of course, I'm thinking about how we measure the experience, right? NPS, et cetera. But it's also bonus structures and who gets rewarded internally within the organization and who gets recognized for their work.
Yeah, and interesting, it's not just the system that has to change, it's the business model oftentimes that has to change. We have to think differently about how we make money or where the money's going to come from if we really want the things to change. This is, I think, one of the huge accomplishments of the entire experience world is this idea of helping companies to see that the money is going to come from the experience itself being a better experience, rather than believing that the money is going to come necessarily because social groups are going to buy into it, or because they bought into kind of a promise that was created. There's a lot of different ways that a company could think about how they're going to generate revenue. And I think some of the great companies out there, like Apple, have shown that it is actually the experience that leads to the brand equity, that leads to the continuity that I think a lot of companies are interested in, and the growth that companies are interested in. So I think that's an important part as well.
I do think so. And I'll give you another metric, for instance. And I teach a course on employee experience at the MBA level. And attrition is often thought of as negative, right? That, you lost people. And that it depends, whether or not it's a bad thing depends on why people are leaving. Mm-hmm. If people are leaving because you did such a good job training them and they can find better opportunities elsewhere, then them leaving is not a bad thing for them. And the question then becomes, how do you leverage that as a benefit for the company? And a good friend of mine, Michael Lowenstein, wrote a book called Employee Ambassadorship. And we've given talks on the linkage between employee experience and customer experience. And this is why some companies are creating employee ambassador programs for employees that left. So you're extending the employee life cycle beyond the departure date, and you're keeping them integrated as part of the larger organizational community beyond the point at which they worked for somebody else. And so attrition is not a bad thing if it's happening for the right reasons. And then it becomes incumbent on companies to figure out how to turn that into a benefit for the organization by keeping connection with those employees that went elsewhere.
That's so smart. And I think the same works with customers, right? If we, especially because we do so much work in the transformation space, we are working with companies who aim to support personal transformation, and they're still judging their success by retention metrics. Perhaps retention metrics actually signal a failure in your product.
I mean, it's not like people stay in marriages they don't like, right? That never happens. And so, like we look at divorce rates, divorce rates used to be so much lower than now. Yeah, but does that mean people were happier? Were they having a better marital experience? I don't know that, right? I mean, we would have to go and, travel on a time machine and go figure that out. But my guess would be it's not that people were necessarily happier, but it's that they stayed in marriages longer. I will also add, and we're working on a book right now. We have a whole chapter on this, on expectations. What are we expecting out of this? Were people's expectations of marriage lower decades ago than today? And if you come in with low expectations, you're less likely to be dissatisfied by the experience you have because you didn't expect much to begin with. That's why I tell my kids, make sure the bar's low. Therefore, it's always easy to go over. No, I don't really tell them that. That would be bad dad. But, you get the point, right? So if we look at a metric like divorce rate, what were the causal factors behind it? What were the complex factors behind it? It might have been low expectations. It might have been social stigma. It might have been the influence of religion on people's decision-making, where that religion has less influence today, and socially speaking in the United States. Was it that people were happier? I mean, who knows? But that's where looking at those complex causal models, this goes back to my quantitative training, as a heuristic becomes useful, because we start to map out those elements which we can think about influencing the thing we're interested in knowing more about, which in this example would be, marital experience and divorce rates, or not just divorce rates, but staying married rates. So rather than looking at why people got divorced, might look at why did they stay married? Not why did people leave us, but why do they stay with us? Mm-hmm. How do we turn and flip it on its head to look at both sides of the coin?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's
so
ultimately,
well
are we doing
put.
our job? Yeah. Yeah. It's really powerful, especially, to apply cultural lenses to experience strategy in all forms helps us, I think, see it at a bit more of a distance and understand it a little more deeply, right? It's somehow easier to ask these questions through these lenses than it is to ask them through, well, is our product doing what we set out to do?
Right.
And at the heart of it, I'm an applied social science, which as an acronym isn't great. When you think about applied social science as an acronym, not a great acronym. But it does talk about how we bring all of this together. What's that?
We'll be sure.
Yeah, don't put
that in the show notes.
So we might think about how do we use the principles from social science to inform what it is we do as experience designers, because after all, people are involved. And the social sciences are about social. And so we want to look at people as an important part, and people are messy. As we know, if we have kids, they're messy. Lives are messy. Cultures are messy. Simplifying it doesn't make it less messy. It just makes us believe it's less messy than it is in real life. And this is why, as experience designers, we translate that messiness and that complexity into action. And so we make sense of the mess. We make sense of the chaos in a way that makes people feel more comfortable dealing with it. And I think that's one of our primary jobs.
Yeah. And I think, too, we have a real responsibility as the translator to ensure the integrity of the translation.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're talking about with so much of this, is that we're like, here's a data point. Go, you nailed it. Why? What is it really?
Right.
And the questions just lead to more questions. But I do think it's worth doing the work. And I just bring us back to that idea of a simplification and really bring in rich insight and understanding with these disciplines so that we're incentivized to do the work to learn to speak each other's languages and to integrate and unify the experience for the end users. And frankly, all the stakeholders. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It is, I just, as I think about this, it absolutely applies to organizational design too. And we haven't even talked about that and about how you design your C-suite to work cohesively. And I just think there are endless applications to this conversation. So we like to end with a few quick key takeaways for experienced strategists. And in this case, I think we do get to think really broadly about experience strategy across all the disciplines we've talked about today, plus so many others that we haven't even tapped into here. And so I want to start with you, Gary. What do you hope experienced strategists will take from this conversation?
I hope that they'll take the responsibility of thinking deeply and thinking intentionally about that complexity, and also developing the skills and methods to translate that complexity into understandable and decipherable units so that it then could be applied to action. So it's the thing I hate about sociologists is that, and I'm speaking as a sociologist, is that we're very eager to sit there and say, here's how complex it is. Now, good luck, versus saying, here's how complex it is, and this is how we can help you manage it. So it's creating experience design as a way of managing that complexity and turning it into strategy and ultimately action.
It's awesome.
What do you think, Dave?
That is awesome.
What do you hope they'll
I've
take?
just loved this conversation. Yeah, well, I've just loved this conversation. I love Gary's perspective. He's bringing just a wonderful perspective. This whole idea that the world of experiences should be integrated within companies, I think, is a very important topic that we really need to be focused on. And I think that the chief experience officer for a number of companies sometimes has to struggle with, okay, how do all of these people work together? What I like about this particular conversation is that we're saying maybe you need to step back just a little bit. One of the great pluses or contributions that experience strategy has made to the company is this ability to step back and see things holistically, and then begin to develop the appropriate approach to simplify things without being simplistic, to lead the organization by having a strong point of view about what the customer really wants. And I think having a strong point of view about what the customer really wants is core to experience strategy. So I don't know, that's kind of my train of thought coming out of this.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I'm remembering as you say that, so much of the writing that you've done in the past about the cost of legacy thinking in increasingly complex organizations. And so many of the practices and frameworks and models that we use are hangovers from history. And they are no longer relevant in our multi-channel, multifaceted, multi-journey worlds. And so we do have to ask tougher questions, and we do have to work harder to find actionable guidance, to your point, Gary. And so I really think this is a call to action to all of us to do better. Wherever we sit in our organizations, at every level, there's an opportunity.
I think you can think about experience design then as the vitamin B12 injection for your legacy hangover.
Yes. Yes. Also putting that in the show notes.
Well put.
Right. Thank you.
Sign me up. You guys, if you've enjoyed listening to Gary, you can get lots more of him at the Experience by Design podcast, which he hosts and where he talks about experience design of all sorts and brings his unique, all kinds. There are so many we see. And where he brings his unique lens to understanding these and simplifying our way of thinking about these and communicating across disciplines while enriching the work that we do. So, Gary, we really appreciate you coming here today to talk to us. I know I feel richer and more energized as a result. And I sense by Dave's suntanned nod, if you are listening to this in podcast form, highly encourage you to get over to our new baby YouTube channel so that you can see Dave's suntan and his Airbnb lighting design. Thank you. for listening and watching. Please keep telling us what you want more and less of. We love hearing from you. And we look forward to bringing you lots more great episodes in the very near future.
Thank you for listening to the Experience Strategy Podcast. If you're having fun nerding out with us, please follow and share wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Find more episodes and continue the conversation with us at experiencestrategypodcast.com.